Story number 1. A girl hitching a ride in the rain. The rain had been relentless all evening, turning the quiet country road into a shimmering ribbon of asphalt that stretched endlessly into the darkness. I was driving home from a late shift at the diner, the headlights of my old sedan cutting through the downpour like lifelines in a sea of gray. My thoughts were a jumble of tiredness and the mundane worries that never seemed to let up until a figure appeared in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow or a reflection. But as I slowed down, the outline became clearer. A young woman stood there, drenched to the bone, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. She looked lost, her eyes wide and searching, reflecting the dim glow of my headlights. I pulled over, the tires screeching slightly on the slick pavement. "Are you okay?" I called out, rolling down the window to shield her from the wind and rain. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked up at me, her expression a mix of relief and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I need a ride." I glanced around. It was the middle of nowhere, just me and her against the endless expanse of rain-soaked woods. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my concern deepening. She hesitated for a moment before pointing ahead, her finger trembling. "There's a house. 5 miles that way. My friend lives there." I frowned, considering the request. It was late, and the road was deserted except for us. "Are you sure?" "It's pretty late." She nodded, her eyes pleading. "I have nowhere else to go." Reluctantly, I unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, her wet hair plastered to her face. She remained silent as I started driving, her gaze fixed on the window as if she was seeing things I couldn't. The rain intensified, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless downpour. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the radio off to avoid any distractions. The road twisted through dense forests, the trees leaning in like silent sentinels guarding secrets. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement in the headlights, shadows flitting between the trees or darting across the road, but nothing more. Finally, the outline of a house appeared through the curtain of rain, a solitary structure nestled among the towering oaks. It was old, the paint peeling and windows darkened by grime. I pulled over, the engine idling as I turned to face her. "Here we are," I said, unsure of what else to say. She gave a small, grateful smile and reached for her umbrella, but I held up a hand. "It's too late for that. Just get out safely." She stepped out into the rain, her figure barely visible in the dim light. "Thank you," she said softly, turning back to me. "I appreciate it." As she walked towards the house, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and her form seemed to waver like a mirage. I watched her disappear into the darkness, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the car. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I started the engine to leave, but something compelled me to follow. I parked a safe distance away and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the storm. The rain pelted my face as I approached the house, the door hanging slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside, the door creaking loudly in protest. The interior was dark and musty, the remnants of a long-abandoned home cloaked in shadows. I called out her name, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. No response. I moved cautiously through the house, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, revealing dust-covered furniture and faded photographs hanging crookedly on the walls. Upstairs, I found her bedroom. The door was closed, but I could see a faint light emanating from under it. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle, hesitating for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was illuminated by a single lamp, its light flickering as if struggling to stay on. She was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw nothing but emptiness reflected in them. "Are you okay?" I asked, taking a step closer. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against my arm. I felt a jolt of electricity run through me, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls bending and warping in impossible ways. Panic surged as the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness once more. The whispers began then, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves outside. But they grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with their eerie chorus. Don't leave us, they moaned, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sorrow and fear. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as if I were rooted to the spot. The temperature dropped further, my breath visible in the frigid air. The room twisted around me, the walls closing in, the whispers growing into desperate pleas. Help us! Remember us! Desperate to break free, I focused on the girl, trying to make sense of her vacant gaze. What do you want? I demanded, my voice shaking. She began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. Remember us, she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant memory. Honor our stories. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from the invisible grip holding me and sprinted towards the door. It swung open, and I tumbled out into the storm, the rain stinging my face as I ran back to the car. Slamming the door shut, I started the engine and sped away, the house receding into the darkness behind me. I didn't stop driving until the storm had passed and the first light of dawn began to break. Shaken and drenched, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, the whispers lingering in my mind like a haunting refrain. The next day, I couldn't get the encounter out of my head. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the house with a notebook and a voice recorder, hoping to document any further evidence of the supernatural. As I entered, the house seemed even more distorted, the architecture defying logic in its warped angles and twisted rooms. I set up my equipment in the living room, the same spot where I had first seen her. Hours passed with no unusual activity, the house appearing deceptively calm. But as night fell again, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, reaching out like dark tendrils across the room. The whispers returned, softer this time, a distant echo that sent chills down my spine. I began to speak, recounting the events of the previous night, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. I'm here to remember your stories, to honor your memories. As I spoke, the room began to change. The walls stretched and twisted, the furniture morphing into shapes that defied explanation. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The temperature dropped again, and the whispers grew louder, their words more distinct. Don't forget us. Remember our pain. The girl appeared once more, her eyes hollow and filled with an endless sorrow. You have to remember, she pleaded, her voice breaking. Only then can we find peace. I nodded, tears streaming down my face as I continued to speak, sharing their stories of loss and tragedy, giving voice to their silent anguish. The house responded, the oppressive energy lifting as the spirits felt their stories being heard and honored. As dawn broke, the house settled into a peaceful stillness, the whispers fading into the morning light. I packed up my equipment, the weight of the night's events settling into my bones. The girl stood at the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the storm clouds. Thank you, she whispered, her form beginning to fade. You've remembered us. With a final nod, she vanished, and the house stood silent, its dark legacy finally finding a semblance of closure. I left the property with a profound sense of purpose, knowing that the spirits of that lonely road had been heard and their stories honored. Back home, I pinned down the events of that stormy night, turning my experience into a narrative that captured the eerie beauty and tragic sorrow of the crooked house. The story resonated with readers, those who believed in the supernatural and those who sought understanding beyond the physical realm. The encounter with the girl and the restless spirits of the crooked house became a testament to the power of remembrance and the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. And sometimes, when the night is still and the rain begins to fall, I can hear the faint echoes of those whispers, a haunting reminder that some stories never truly end, they linger, waiting to be remembered and honored by those who dare to listen. Story number 2. The Strange Man on the Highway. The highway stretched out before me like an endless ribbon, the asphalt slick with the remnants of a late summer rain. Night had fallen, and the darkness was broken only by the intermittent glow of my truck's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. I was miles away from the nearest town, the solitude of the open road both comforting and unnerving. My name is Jack Thompson, and I've been hauling goods across this country for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of oddities on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for the encounter that would forever change my perception of reality. It was around midnight when the headlights of an old sedan flickered in my rearview mirror. A solitary figure stood by the roadside, illuminated briefly as I slowed down. The man was tall and gaunt, his clothes drenched from the rain, clinging to his frame like a second skin. There was something unsettling about him, an aura of melancholy that seemed to seep from his very presence. I pulled over, the tires screeching slightly on the wet pavement. "Need a ride?" I called out, rolling down the window to offer assistance. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he approached my truck with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When he finally reached the passenger side, he nodded silently, accepting my offer without a word. He climbed into the truck, settling into the seat beside me. His silence was eerie, broken only by the sound of the windshield wipers swishing back and forth against the rain-soaked glass. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional clap of thunder in the distance. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he remained unresponsive, his gaze fixed on the road ahead as if searching for something I couldn't see. The night air was thick with tension, the darkness outside pressing in on us from all sides. As we approached a desolate stretch of highway, the man finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Take me to the old Miller place," he said, his words clipped and devoid of emotion. I glanced at the map, recognizing the name immediately. The Miller place was an abandoned farmhouse known for its tragic history, a family that vanished without a trace one stormy night decades ago. Local legends spoke of restless spirits and unexplained phenomena surrounding the property, but I dismissed them as mere folklore. Desperate to make my deadline, I agreed to take him there. The drive was tense, the road narrowing as we approached the secluded property. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, its dilapidated structure barely visible through the heavy rain. We pulled into the gravel driveway, and the man stepped out into the storm, his figure slowly fading into the darkness as he made his way toward the house. I watched him disappear into the shadows, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of my truck. Shaking off the unease, I turned to leave, but something compelled me to follow. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way through the pouring rain, the old farmhouse standing silent and foreboding before me. As I approached the house, the air grew colder, the storm intensifying around me. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying with the force of the wind. I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a mournful wail. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the lightning flashes that briefly illuminated the decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the house. No response. Determined to find answers, I ventured deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath my weight. In what used to be the living room, I found remnants of the past, tattered curtains, broken picture frames, and a dusty piano that seemed out of place in the decaying room. As I approached the piano, the first notes of a haunting melody filled the air, the keys moving on their own in a sorrowful tune that sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen to navigate the room. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. Out of the shadows, the man from the truck appeared, his face still obscured by darkness. I froze, unable to move as he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Then, in a split second, his features twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, menacing fangs that glinted in the dim light. "Thank you for the ride," he hissed, his voice no longer devoid of emotion but filled with malice. "Next time, it will be your turn." Before I could react, he lunged at me, his fangs aiming for my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen chair and hitting the floor hard. The last thing I saw was his menacing grin before everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was outside the farmhouse, the storm having passed and the first light of dawn breaking through the clouds. My truck was nowhere in sight, and the gravel driveway was slick with rain. Trembling and drenched, I stumbled back to my vehicle, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the passenger seat, I found a crumpled piece of paper, damp and smudged but still legible. The message read, "Thank you for the ride. Next time, it will be your turn." Fear gnawed at me as I realized the truth. Something supernatural had been at play, something far beyond my understanding. I sped away from the farmhouse, my mind racing with questions and a newfound respect for the legends that haunted these desolate roads. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange noises echoed in the quiet of the night, and shadows seemed to dance just beyond the corner of my vision. The encounter at the Miller place left an indelible mark on me, a reminder that some roads lead to places where the veil between the living and the dead is perilously thin. I shared my story with friends and fellow truckers, many of whom dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of the open road. But a few believed, sharing their own tales of strange encounters and unexplained phenomena on desolate highways. It seemed that the road I traveled was not just a path for the living but a gateway for restless spirits seeking passage and revenge. Years later, the memory of that rainy night still haunts me. I've continued driving, but with a heightened awareness of the shadows and whispers that accompany me on long, lonely stretches of highway. The Miller place remains abandoned, its secrets locked away in the decaying walls, a testament to the horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when the rain starts to fall and the highway stretches out before me like an endless ribbon of darkness, I catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure on the roadside, a reminder of that night when a simple act of kindness led me into a nightmare from which I've yet to fully escape. The road remains a place of mystery and fear, where the living and the dead intersect in a dance of shadows and whispers, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to give them a ride. Story number 3. The Silent Fair. The city lights of downtown seemed miles away as I drove through the empty streets on a chilly November night. It was one of those late shifts that stretched endlessly, each mile blending into the next under the dim glow of my Uber app. My name is Mike Sullivan, and after years of navigating the city's veins as a rideshare driver, I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for the encounter that awaited me on that desolate stretch of highway. It was around 2 a.m. when the app notified me of a new ride request. The pickup location was a quiet corner near the old industrial district, an area rarely bustling at this hour. I sighed, glanced at my watch, and accepted the fare. The car's interior was already warm, the heater humming softly against the chill outside. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty, yet I knew someone was on their way. As I approached the pickup point, the rain had started to fall, a steady drizzle that made the asphalt glisten under the streetlights. I parked my car and stepped out, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the rain-soaked pavement as I waited, the city's usual nighttime noises replaced by the rhythmic tapping of raindrops. A few minutes later, a woman in white approached. She moved with a graceful, almost ethereal quality, her long dress billowing slightly in the wind. Her hair was dark, cascading over her shoulders, contrasting sharply with her pale complexion. There was an unsettling stillness about her, a silent melancholy that set my nerves on edge. "Good evening," I greeted, unlocking the door for her. She didn't respond, simply sliding into the back seat and pulling the door shut. The interior light cast her shadow long and distorted across the back seat, her presence both captivating and eerie. I started the engine, the familiar hum of the car breaking the silence. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the window as we pulled away from the curb. The ride was quiet, the only sound the rain pattering against the windshield and the occasional distant clap of thunder. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, expecting to see her eyes meeting mine, but she continued to stare outward, her expression unreadable. As we drove further away from the city, the landscape changed. The urban sprawl gave way to dense woods and winding roads that seemed to stretch into nowhere. The headlights illuminated the trees, their branches swaying gently in the storm, creating fleeting shadows that danced across the car's interior. Minutes turned into hours as we traversed the winding highway, the woman's silence growing more oppressive with each passing mile. I attempted small talk, mentioning the weather or asking about her day, but she remained unresponsive, her presence a constant, unsettling force in the back seat. Finally, we approached a secluded area where the road ended at a large, wrought-iron gate. Beyond it lay an old mansion, its once grand facade now weathered and overgrown with ivy. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the storm beginning to wane as we came to a stop. "This is it," I said, turning to the passenger side. She still didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the mansion ahead. I hesitated for a moment, then reached back to ask for payment. But when I turned around, the back seat was completely empty. My heart raced as I looked around, expecting to see her standing there, but there was nothing, only the lingering scent of rain and the faint echo of her silent presence. Panic surged through me as I scanned the car, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had she vanished into thin air? I reached out to the empty seat, my fingers trembling, but found nothing, only the cold, empty space where she had been moments before. Shaken, I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the mansion looming before me like a dark sentinel. The address she had given me was for an old family estate, abandoned for years, but still standing as a relic of a bygone era. I glanced at my phone, hoping to find some trace of her, but there was nothing, no messages, no reviews, nothing to explain her sudden disappearance. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I approached the mansion, the rain having ceased entirely, leaving the night eerily silent. The gates creaked open as I pushed them, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The house stood majestically against the night sky, its windows dark and foreboding, the once ornate decorations now obscured by shadows. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But there was no response, only the sound of my own voice echoing back at me. I tried the handle, it was unlocked. Swallowing my fear, I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the grand foyer filled with the remnants of a lavish past. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dull with dust, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow my every move. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, a silent testament to the house's long abandonment. I made my way through the halls, each room more unsettling than the last. Furniture lay scattered, draped in white sheets that fluttered slightly in the absence of wind. The silence was broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet and the distant sound of dripping water. As I explored further, I felt a presence, an invisible force that seemed to press down on me, making it hard to breathe. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, disappearing whenever I turned to look directly at them. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on me, each step deeper into the mansion heightening my sense of dread. In the heart of the house, I found a grand library, its shelves lined with dusty tomes and forgotten artifacts. A large fireplace dominated the room, the empty hearth a stark contrast to the warmth it once provided. As I approached the mantel, I heard it, the faint sound of soft, sorrowful weeping. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a young woman standing by the window. She was dressed entirely in white, her hair cascading down her back, her eyes hollow and filled with endless sadness. She turned to face me, her expression one of profound sorrow and longing. "Why are you here?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her hand, pointing toward the window where a reflection shimmered on the glass. I peered outside, the reflection revealing a ghostly image of a man, his face twisted in agony, his eyes burning with an unspoken rage. Before I could react, she vanished, leaving me alone in the silent room. The temperature dropped once more, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Determined to leave, I retraced my steps back to the foyer, but the house seemed to have changed. Hallways twisted and turned in impossible directions, rooms that weren't there before now blocking my path. Panic surged as I realized I was lost within the mansion's labyrinthine depths. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time, echoing through the halls like a chorus of anguished souls. "Remember us. Honor our stories." The voices were filled with pain and desperation, their pleas intertwining with the shifting architecture of the house. Desperate to escape, I ran through the twisting corridors, the house seeming to resist my every move. Doors slammed shut behind me, windows barred themselves, and the shadows moved with a life of their own, guiding me deeper into the mansion's heart. The weeping and whispers followed, a constant reminder of the restless spirits that lingered within. Finally, I burst into the grand foyer once more, the door still locked behind me. The air was thick with sorrow, the oppressive energy almost suffocating. In the center of the room stood the woman in white once again, her form more defined and her presence more commanding. She reached out to me, her eyes pleading. "You must remember us," she whispered, her voice echoing with the weight of countless untold stories. "Only then can we find peace." Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded, understanding the depth of their suffering. "I will remember," I vowed, my voice steady despite the fear gripping me. I will honor your stories. As I spoke, the atmosphere began to shift. The oppressive energy lifted, the whispers softened, and the shadows retreated, their presence fading into the air like morning mist. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the dark legacy finally finding a semblance of closure. The door unlocked itself, allowing me to leave the mansion's grasp. I stepped outside into the now calm night, the first light of dawn breaking through the clouds and illuminating the property with a gentle glow. The house stood silent and still, its dark history finally at peace. Driving away from the crooked house, I couldn't shake the feeling of connection to the restless spirits I had encountered. Their stories had been remembered and honored, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the thin veil that separates our world from the supernatural. The experience left me with a profound sense of responsibility to share their stories and ensure that their voices were never forgotten. Years later, the memory of that night remains vivid in my mind. The Silent Fair became the cornerstone of my latest book, a narrative that intertwined personal experience with the chilling history of the crooked house. Readers were captivated by the tale, drawn to the haunting beauty and tragic sorrow that defined the mansion's legacy. Visitors still report strange occurrences, faint weeping, ghostly apparitions, and the unsettling feeling of being watched, each adding to the house's reputation as a place where the past and present coexist in a delicate balance. But thanks to my efforts, there's a sense of peace that permeates the property, the restless spirits finally finding solace in their stories being remembered and honored. And sometimes, when the night is still and the rain begins to fall, I can hear the faint echoes of their whispers, a haunting reminder that some stories never truly end, they linger, waiting to be remembered and honored by those brave enough to listen. Story number 4. The Hitchhiker's Shadow. Driving through the quiet stretches of rural Michigan on a stormy Friday night had always been a meditative experience for me and Jenna. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the wet asphalt, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the dense woods, and the soothing sound of rain tapping against the windshield created a backdrop that was both calming and introspective. We were on our way home after a long week, eager to unwind in the comfort of our small cabin nestled deep within the forest. The sky was a tumultuous canvas of dark clouds, the occasional rumble of thunder reminding us of nature's untamed power. Jenna, ever the cautious one, kept her eyes fixed on the road, while I glanced occasionally at my phone, scrolling through messages and planning the weekend ahead. It was around midnight when the serenity of our drive was interrupted by a flicker of headlights in our rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was another truck driver seeking a break from the storm, but as we continued, the car approached our speed. It was an old sedan, its lights dimmed and barely cutting through the downpour. Jenna glanced back, her brows furrowing. "Do you think we should stop?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I shrugged, feeling a pang of curiosity. "It's late, and it's dangerous out here. Maybe he just needs a ride." Reluctantly, Jenna nodded, and I pulled over to the side of the road. The sedan slowed as we approached, and a man in his late 30s stepped out, drenched from the rain. He wore a worn-out trench coat that clung to his frame, and his face was partially obscured by a hood. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something unsettling about his presence. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I really need to get home." We exchanged a brief glance before Jenna unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed into the back seat without a word. The silence that followed was thick, the only sounds being the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. He stared straight ahead, his eyes darting occasionally to the rearview mirror as if expecting someone, or something, to follow him. As we drove through the deserted highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's demeanor was strange, his movements stiff and deliberate. He didn't offer any small talk, just sat there, clutching a large, worn-out backpack tightly against his chest. Jenna tried to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the darkened road ahead. Unease settled over me, the initial curiosity now replaced by a creeping dread. We continued driving, the storm intensifying, the rain turning into a relentless downpour that blurred the world outside into a monochromatic haze. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a small, isolated house appear on the horizon, its silhouette barely visible through the rain. "That's the place," the man finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." I pulled into the gravel driveway, the house looking abandoned, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The man reached into his backpack, pulling out a crumpled envelope. "Here you go," he said, tossing it to me. "Thank you for the ride." Confused, I picked up the envelope, turning it over in my hands. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in messy handwriting. Jenna leaned forward, curiosity getting the better of her. "Why are you thanking us?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up abruptly, pushing the door open and disappearing into the darkness without another word. I watched him go, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the truck's interior. We sat there for a moment, processing the encounter, before I decided to follow up. "Jenna, we should probably check if everything's okay," I suggested, my voice wavering slightly. She hesitated but nodded, and we made our way to the front door. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the relentless rain pounding against the windows. I grabbed my phone and called the number printed on the envelope, hoping to find some explanation. The call went straight to voicemail, the only message being a faint, distorted voice saying, "Thank you." My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it all. I glanced back at the envelope, noticing for the first time the dark stain of dried blood near the top edge. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Determined to uncover the truth, we decided to investigate. We approached the house cautiously, the rain-soaked ground making our steps slippery. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind as if inviting us in. Inside, the house was just as we'd seen it, dark, abandoned, with an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on us. We explored room by room, the remnants of a life long forgotten scattered around. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and every step echoed ominously through the empty halls. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a room that looked like it had been used as a study. Papers were strewn across the desk, and old photographs lined the walls, their subjects staring blankly into space. As I sifted through the papers, I found a newspaper clipping detailing a gruesome murder that had occurred just weeks before. The headline read, "Local man found dead with bloodied axe, case remains unsolved." The description matched the man we had just picked up, his name, a name I recognized from the envelope as Thomas Reed. Jenna shivered, her eyes wide with fear. "So, he was killed on this road?" I nodded, my mind racing. "It looks like it. Maybe his spirit is trying to communicate, to thank us for something." Before we could ponder further, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath became visible in the cold air as we felt an oppressive presence pressing down on us. The room seemed to distort, objects shifting and warping before our eyes. The once tidy study transformed into a nightmarish scene, papers flying, furniture twisting into grotesque shapes, and the faint sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. We backed away, only to see the ghostly figure of Thomas Reed standing before us, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. He reached out, his hand trembling as he pointed to the floor. Beneath him lay the very axe mentioned in the news clipping, its blade dripping with fresh blood that had miraculously reappeared despite being dry just moments before. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice echoing through the room like a mournful wind. "You saved me." Fear rooted me to the spot as his form began to fade, the room returning to its original state of decay. The oppressive presence lifted, leaving us alone in the silent house. Jenna and I exchanged a terrified glance, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily upon us. We fled the house, the storm now subsiding, leaving behind an uneasy calm. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of Thomas Reed's sorrowful eyes and the bloodied axe that had appeared out of nowhere. The encounter left us both shaken, the lines between the living and the dead blurred by the supernatural event we had witnessed. In the days that followed, the story spread through the town, the mysterious disappearance of Thomas Reed becoming the subject of much speculation. Some believed we had encountered his restless spirit, seeking closure after his untimely death. Others dismissed it as a figment of our imagination, a product of the isolation and the stormy night. But Jenna and I knew what we had experienced was real. The envelope, the bloodstained axe, and the ghostly apparition were undeniable evidence of something beyond our understanding. We decided to keep the experience to ourselves, fearing ridicule and the scrutiny that often accompany such tales. Yet, every time a storm rolled in, I couldn't help but think of Thomas Reed and wonder if the spirits were still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to be heard. The memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder that the world is filled with unseen forces, and that sometimes a simple act of kindness can bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And so, as I continue to drive through the quiet stretches of rural Michigan, I remain ever vigilant, hoping to avoid another encounter with the supernatural. But deep down, I know that the shadows hold countless stories, waiting for someone to listen, to remember, and to honor the restless souls that wander the lonely roads in the dead of night. Story number 5. The Shadow Behind. The night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt as I drove down the deserted highway. My old sedan hummed steadily, the steady rhythm of the tires on the wet road providing a semblance of comfort in the otherwise oppressive darkness. It was well past midnight, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the overhanging trees and the distant rumble of thunder, hinting at an approaching storm. My mind was a maze of thoughts, deadlines, bills, the endless cycle of life that often felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I needed a break, a momentary escape from the relentless grind. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, my eyes met the empty expanse of the back seat. It was a habit of mine, a way to reassure myself that I was alone, that the solitude of the night was truly just that. But then, in the dim glow of my headlights, a figure appeared on the roadside. A young woman, her silhouette barely visible through the downpour, stood by the edge of the highway. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin, and her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to plead silently for help. I slowed the car, the tires squealing slightly against the wet pavement. "Need a ride?" I called out, rolling down the window to offer shelter from the storm. She hesitated for a moment before approaching the car, her movements slow and deliberate. There was something unsettling about her presence, an aura of sadness that seemed to seep from her very being. As she climbed into the passenger seat, I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, as if she was expecting someone, or something, to follow her. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of unease. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. I glanced back again, trying to catch her eyes, but she avoided my stare, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coat. The rain intensified, turning the windshield into a sheet of water that blurred the world outside into a monochromatic haze. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound the relentless tapping of raindrops against the glass and the distant rumble of thunder. I tried to engage her in conversation, hoping to ease the tension, but she remained unresponsive, her silence growing heavier with each passing mile. It was as if she was carrying a burden too heavy to share, a story too tragic to speak aloud. Eventually, we approached a stretch of highway that seemed even more desolate than the rest, flanked by dense woods that swallowed the light of my headlights. My pulse quickened as I glanced in the rearview mirror once more, expecting to see her watching me, but the back seat was empty. Panic surged through me as I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped out of the car, her figure disappearing into the darkness like a wraith. I rushed to the back, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there, only the lingering scent of rain and a chilling sense of emptiness. Confusion and dread gnawed at me as I frantically searched the back seat, my hands trembling as I reached out into the void. That's when I noticed the faint imprint of a hand on the window, a ghostly mark that had vanished in the blink of an eye. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she vanished into thin air? Was she ever really there? The questions swirled in my head, each one more unsettling than the last. Determined to find answers, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number I had just given her, hoping to hear her voice and dispel the haunting uncertainty. But the call went straight to voicemail, the only message being the faint sound of static and a desperate plea, "Thank you." The next day, the sun was bright and clear, a stark contrast to the stormy night that had left me rattled to my core. I couldn't shake the memory of the encounter, the woman's silent plea, and the eerie emptiness of the back seat. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate. I searched online for any reports of sightings or unusual activity on that stretch of highway, but nothing surfaced, no one seemed to have seen her, and no incidents were reported that matched my experience. Frustrated and unsettled, I reached out to a local historian, hoping to uncover any hidden stories or forgotten tragedies tied to the area. She listened intently as I recounted my story, her expression a mix of sympathy and intrigue. There have been rumors, she began, of a woman who lost her life on that very road years ago. They say she was caught in a terrible accident during a storm, her car swamped by the raging rain. Some believe her spirit still wanders those roads, searching for a way to find peace. My heart sank as the pieces began to fit together. The stormy night, the lonely highway, the silent plea, could it be that I had encountered her spirit? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a realization that some encounters transcend the boundaries of the living and the dead. Determined to honor her memory and perhaps help her find peace, I returned to the highway one evening, armed with a small candle and a piece of paper. I parked my car at the spot where I had first seen her, the rain beginning to fall softly once more. Lighting the candle, I placed it on the hood of the car, hoping that the light would guide her or at least offer a symbol of remembrance. As the rain continued to fall, I sat there in silence, the candle flickering in the darkness. Minutes passed without incident, the only sounds the gentle patter of raindrops and the distant rumble of thunder. Just as I was about to give up hope, a soft light appeared near the roadside, growing brighter as it approached the car. My heart leapt with anticipation as the figure of a woman in white materialized, her form shimmering like a mirage in the rain. She approached the car slowly, her presence both ethereal and sorrowful. I reached out, speaking softly, "I'm sorry for your loss. I hope you find peace." She smiled, a gesture filled with gratitude and sadness, and placed her hand on the hood of the car. The light from the candle and her presence created a warm glow, dispelling the darkness and the oppressive weight that had lingered since that first encounter. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the storm calming as if responding to her need for closure. With a final nod, she turned and walked away, her form dissolving into the rain-soaked night like a whispered promise. The candle burned steadily, its flame a beacon of hope and remembrance. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a connection made between the living and the departed, a small step towards healing the lingering pain of a restless spirit. As I drove away from the spot, the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, the highway stretching out before me with a newfound sense of peace. The memory of that night remained etched in my mind, a haunting reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. And sometimes, when the storm clouds gather and the rain begins to fall, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, a silent guardian in white, watching over the lonely road she once called home. Story number 6. The Unseen Passenger. The road stretched out before us like a dark, endless ribbon, the headlights of our aging sedan piercing through the thick blanket of night. My wife, Margaret, and I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of a distant owl our only companions. The late autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and impending rain. It was the kind of night that felt heavy with unspoken secrets, the silence broken only by the rhythmic tapping of the windshield wipers against the steady drizzle. I glanced over at Margaret, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her expression weary but alert. We had been married for nearly 40 years, our lives intertwined in a tapestry of shared memories and silent understandings. Yet, even after all those years, the roads we traveled together still held the capacity to surprise and unsettle us in ways we couldn't foresee. It was around 2 a.m. when the faint glow of headlights appeared in our rearview mirror, growing steadily as a car approached us from the opposite direction. I slowed down, curiosity piqued by the solitary figure that became more visible as the car drew nearer. A young man, no older than 25, sat hunched over the steering wheel, his jacket soaked from the rain, his eyes reflecting a mixture of desperation and fatigue. "Need a ride?" I called out, rolling down the passenger window to offer assistance. He hesitated for a moment before pulling up alongside us. The passenger door slid open with a soft creak, and he climbed in silently, his presence unsettling in the confined space of our sedan. Margaret glanced back, concern etched on her face, but I nodded reassuringly. "Where are you headed?" He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, staring into the void as if searching for something just out of reach. I reached over to offer him a bottle of water, but his hand brushed mine briefly, cold and clammy, sending a shiver down my spine. "It's okay," I said softly. "We're here to help." The car continued down the desolate highway, the storm intensifying around us. The rain pelted the windshield with renewed vigor, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, swallowing the landscape in its inky embrace. The young man remained silent, his eyes occasionally darting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting someone, or something, to follow us. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a secluded area where the road narrowed and the trees grew dense, their branches intertwining overhead like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. "This is it," I said, pulling over to the side of the road. "You can get out here." He nodded once, a gesture so slight it was almost imperceptible, and began to unbuckle his seatbelt. As he reached for his bag, I noticed something peculiar, a worn, faded coat resting on the back seat, almost as if it had been left there intentionally. Before I could question it, he handed the coat to me, his fingers brushing against mine in a fleeting moment that felt laden with unspoken emotions. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. We watched in silence as he stepped out of the car, the rain cascading around him in torrents. He paused for a moment, glancing back at us before turning and disappearing into the darkness, his figure swallowed whole by the night. Margaret and I exchanged puzzled looks, the atmosphere thick with unease. Shaking off the feeling, we continued our journey home, the events of the night playing on a loop in my mind. The young man's presence lingered, a ghostly imprint that refused to fade. The next morning, curiosity gnawed at me as I remembered the coat he had left behind. "Margaret, did you see that coat he gave us last night?" She nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the same confusion and concern that I felt. "Yeah, I did. Maybe he left it by mistake?" Determined to find answers, I decided to return to the spot where we had picked him up. The memory of his silent plea and the unsettling feeling of his presence compelled me to seek the truth. We drove back to the same desolate highway, the rain having ceased but the air still heavy with remnants of the storm. Parking at the exact location, I stepped out of the car, the coat still lying on the passenger seat, untouched. The night was calm now, the darkness still pressing in but devoid of the storm's wrath. I approached the road cautiously, the coat in hand, and began to search for any sign of the young man. Hours passed with no sign, the only evidence of his presence being the coat and the lingering sense of unease that settled over me like a shroud. Frustrated and tired, I decided to head back, the unanswered questions festering in my mind. As I glanced over at Margaret, she suggested we visit the local library to see if there were any reports of accidents or missing persons in the area. The library was quiet, the musty scent of old books filling the air as I pored over the archives. It was there that I stumbled upon a newspaper clipping from 5 years ago, detailing a tragic accident on the very road we had traveled. A young man named David Miller had been found dead at the site, his car wrecked beyond recognition, the circumstances surrounding his death shrouded in mystery. No one had claimed him, and the case had gone cold, his family never able to find closure. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces began to fit together. The young man we had given a ride to, was it possible that we had encountered his restless spirit? The realization was both terrifying and deeply unsettling, the implications of our encounter settling heavy on my conscience. Determined to make peace with what had happened, I decided to return to the crash site, the coat now a symbol of our connection to the lost soul. As night fell once more, I drove back to the desolate highway, the memories of that stormy night fueling my resolve. Parking at the exact spot where David had met his untimely end, I stepped out of the car, the coat in hand, and began to speak softly into the stillness. "David, if you're out there, I hope you can find peace. I'm sorry for not being able to help you last night." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadowy figure standing by the roadside, watching us with hollow eyes. My heart pounded as I took a step forward, the coat draped over my arm, the symbol of our encounter now a bridge between the living and the dead. As I spoke, a gentle warmth enveloped me, a stark contrast to the cold night air. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a serene calm that seemed to wash over the landscape. The shadows retreated, and the figure of David began to fade, his sorrowful presence giving way to a sense of closure. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the soft rustling of the leaves. "May you rest in peace." With those words, the connection between us was severed, the restless spirit finally finding the peace he had long sought. The coat, now lying peacefully on the ground, seemed to shimmer briefly before disappearing into the night, leaving behind only the echoes of a silent farewell. Driving back home, the first light of dawn breaking through the horizon, I felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. The encounter had been a stark reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown, a testament to the enduring bonds of empathy and the unspoken connections that tie us to the souls who wander the night. Margaret reached over, taking my hand in hers, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and awe that I felt. "Do you think he's okay now?" she asked softly. I nodded, a sense of peace settling over me. "I think so. We've done what we could." As we continued our journey home, the darkness receded, replaced by the gentle hues of a new day dawning. The memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the unseen passengers we share the road with, their stories intertwined with our own in ways we may never fully understand. And sometimes, when the rain begins to fall and the night grows quiet, I catch myself glancing into the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in white, a silent guardian watching over the lonely roads, reminding me that every encounter holds a story, waiting to be remembered and honored. Story number 7. The Haunting Laugh. The night air was thick with mist as I drove my truck along the desolate highway that cut through the heart of rural Maine. It was one of those long-haul nights where the road seemed endless, stretching out into darkness with only the intermittent glow of my headlights to guide me. Fatigue weighed heavily on my shoulders, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic motion of the cab my only companions. I was miles from the nearest town, the silence of the night broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Around 2 a.m., as I rounded a particularly lonely stretch of highway, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A lone figure stood by the roadside, illuminated briefly by the beam of my headlights before fading into the shadows. It was a woman, her silhouette barely discernible through the mist, wearing a long coat that clung to her form like a second skin. Her presence was unsettling, an inexplicable chill settling in the pit of my stomach. I slowed the truck, the tires screeching softly on the wet pavement. "Need a ride?" I called out, rolling down the window to offer assistance. The air inside the cab was warm, a stark contrast to the cold night outside. She approached slowly, her steps deliberate yet hesitant. As she climbed into the passenger seat, I couldn't help but notice her constant, unnerving smile. Her laughter was soft but persistent, echoing through the cab in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to engage her in conversation, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead as if she was searching for something, or someone, just out of sight. "Where are you headed?" I asked, attempting to break the heavy silence. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Handing it to me without a word, her fingers brushed against mine, sending a shiver down my spine. I unfolded the note, reading the hastily scrawled address, an old, abandoned intersection just a few miles ahead. "Thank you," I murmured, though she didn't reply. Her presence was both comforting and terrifying, a paradox that left me uneasy as I resumed driving. As we approached the designated location, the road narrowed into a sharp bend, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in around us. The mist thickened, obscuring my view and lending an eerie quality to the surroundings. I took a deep breath, attempting to steady my nerves, and turned onto the bend. The intersection was empty, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. I slowed down, preparing to drop her off, but before I could pull over, she let out a sudden, piercing scream. "I died here." Startled, I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the slick asphalt before coming to a halt. My heart raced as I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her reacting to my sudden stop. But the passenger seat was empty, gone without a trace. Panic surged through me as I looked around, the silence of the night now oppressive and suffocating. Fumbling with the door handle, I opened the passenger door and peered inside, only to find nothing but the darkness of the cab. Confusion and fear gnawed at me, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined the entire encounter? The constant laughter, her unsettling smile, it all felt too vivid to dismiss as mere fatigue. Gathering my courage, I stepped out of the truck and approached the roadside where she had vanished. The rain had softened to a light drizzle, the sound of droplets tapping against the asphalt a rhythmic reminder of the night's dampness. My eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of her, but there was nothing, only the empty expanse of the highway and the dense woods beyond. Determined to find answers, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the address written on the note. The road twisted through the woods, the trees looming like silent sentinels watching my every move. The mist swirled around me, enveloping the world in a shroud of gray. As I navigated the narrow path, a sense of dread settled over me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Finally, I reached the old intersection, its corners marked by crumbling concrete barriers and overgrown weeds. The streetlights flickered erratically, their weak beams struggling to penetrate the dense fog. I shone my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I heard it, a faint, ghostly laughter echoing through the night, the same eerie sound the woman had made earlier. My blood ran cold as I turned, my flashlight catching a glimpse of a figure standing at the far end of the intersection. It was her, the woman in white, her long coat billowing in the gentle breeze, her smile twisted into something sinister as she looked directly at me. I froze, my mind screaming to turn and run, but my body remained rooted to the spot. "I died here," she repeated, her voice a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't have come." Summoning every ounce of bravery, I took a step forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" Her laughter filled the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate with the very essence of the night. "Remember me," she said, her eyes glinting with an otherworldly light. "Remember what happened here." Before I could respond, the air around us seemed to distort, the boundaries of reality bending and warping. The intersection twisted into a nightmarish vision of past tragedies, vehicles crashing, screams echoing through the mist, and shadows that danced with malevolent intent. I felt a pull, a force drawing me deeper into the horrifying scene, the weight of countless untold stories pressing down on me. Desperate to escape, I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the slick pavement as I fled back to my truck. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more frenzied, as if the very essence of the intersection was trying to drag me back into its tragic history. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. I reached my truck, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from the intersection, the woman's laughter fading into the night but leaving an indelible mark on my soul. The storm had passed, but the memory of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the unseen forces that inhabit the shadows of our world. The next morning, driven by a need to understand, I delved into local archives, piecing together the history of the highway and the many accidents that had occurred at that very bend. Stories of drivers losing control in the rain, their lives claimed by the unforgiving road, were commonplace, but one name stood out: Sarah Collins. A young woman who had been caught in a tragic accident on that stretch of highway, her car wrecked by a vicious storm, her life cut short in a split second. As I read through the accounts, the connection became painfully clear. The woman who had boarded my truck was Sarah Collins, a spirit bound to the intersection, her sorrow and rage manifesting through the eerie laughter and ghostly presence. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. In offering her a ride, I had inadvertently bridged the gap between the living and the dead, becoming a part of her endless story. Determined to help her find peace, I returned to the intersection under clearer skies, the mist now dissipated and the road stretching out before me with a deceptive sense of calm. I parked my truck and stood alone at the bend, the weight of my responsibility pressing down on me. "Sarah," I called out softly, hoping to reach her spirit, "I'm sorry for what happened. I want to help you find peace." The air around me seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, I thought I saw her, Sarah Collins, standing at the edge of the road, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of countless untold stories. "Remember us." With that, her presence began to fade, the oppressive energy lifting as her spirit found the closure she had long sought. The intersection returned to its peaceful state, the tragedies of the past no longer holding her bound to the night. Driving away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, knowing that I had played a part in helping a restless soul find peace. The memory of that night would forever haunt me, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown and the enduring power of compassion to bridge that divide. And sometimes, when the rain begins to fall and the night grows quiet, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to see a fleeting shadow or hear a faint laugh. But most nights, all is silent, the highway stretching out before me like an endless journey between the living and the dead, each mile a testament to the stories that linger in the shadows, waiting to be remembered and honored.